Enjoy the view, Vanessa. My ex-husband wrote beneath the photo of a penthouse overlooking Manhattan. Some people spend years dreaming of this life. We decided to live it. I stared at the image on my phone for a long moment. The floor-to-ceiling windows. The champagne glasses. The skyline glowing gold in the late afternoon sun. Richard stood beside a woman nearly 30 years younger than me, smiling as though the last 42 years of our marriage had been nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. Most people probably expected me to cry. Some might have expected me to call him. Others would have imagined me sitting alone in my kitchen, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. Instead, I smiled. Then I looked at my watch. They had been celebrating for exactly 27 minutes. I should explain something. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 67 years old. And despite what Richard liked telling people at country clubs and business dinners, I was never the woman who simply stood beside him while he built an empire. I helped create it. For decades, I sat through meetings, reviewed contracts, and helped navigate more financial storms than most people could imagine. Yet after the divorce became final, Richard seemed determined to rewrite history. According to him, he had built everything alone. According to him, I had merely benefited from his success. The newspapers never printed my side. Friends who only knew us socially accepted his version without question. It was easier that way. Simpler. People enjoy stories with clear heroes and villains. They rarely ask whether the person smiling for the cameras is hiding something. My phone buzzed again. Another photo. Vanessa standing on the penthouse balcony with her arms stretched toward the skyline. The caption read, "New beginnings." I set the phone face down on the marble countertop and walked toward the large windows of my Connecticut home. The evening sky was turning soft shades of orange and blue. Beyond the lawn, the trees moved gently in the breeze. Everything looked peaceful, calm, ordinary. Yet beneath that calm surface, something had already begun moving. Earlier that afternoon, I had received a call from Martin Hughes, the attorney who had handled several complex matters for our family over the years. Martin was not the type of man who called without reason. In fact, he disliked unnecessary conversations so much that every phone call from him felt significant. "Evelyn," he had said, his voice unusually measured, "I need you to check something." That was all. No explanation. No details. Just those few words. I remembered standing in this very kitchen, staring at the espresso machine while he spoke. "Should I be worried?" I asked. There was a pause. "Not worried," he replied. "Interested." Then he told me to watch carefully over the next few days. Before hanging up, he added one sentence that stayed with me all afternoon. Sometimes people reveal their biggest mistakes when they believe they've already won. At the time, I wasn't entirely sure what he meant. But now, looking again at Richard's celebration photos, I felt something shift. Not anger. Not sadness. Something colder. Something quieter. Confidence. Richard believed the divorce was over. He believed the money was secure. He believed the future belonged to him and Vanessa. Most importantly, he believed there were no more surprises left. That was his mistake. Because while he was busy showing off a penthouse worth $18 million, a process had already started somewhere deep inside a network of accounts, trusts, agreements, and signatures he had forgotten existed. I picked up my phone one final time and looked at the smiling faces on the screen. Richard looked happier than he had in years. Vanessa looked victorious. Neither of them noticed the irony. Neither of them realized that the balance they were celebrating was no longer the balance they thought they owned. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, a habit I had never managed to break even after retirement. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of rain tapping against the windows. I made coffee, carried the mug into the sunroom, and sat in the same chair where I had spent countless mornings over the years reviewing budgets, investment reports, and business proposals. Richard used to joke that I trusted spreadsheets more than people. Looking back, perhaps that was not entirely wrong. Numbers rarely lied. People often did. My phone remained silent for most of the morning. Richard was busy celebrating. Vanessa was undoubtedly enjoying every minute of her new life. Meanwhile, I found myself thinking about a meeting that had taken place nearly 18 years earlier. At the time, our company had been growing faster than anyone expected. New investors were calling every week. Banks were eager to extend credit. Everyone around us seemed intoxicated by success. Everyone except me. I had spent my childhood watching my father lose nearly everything during a market downturn. That experience left a mark on me. While others saw opportunity, I always searched for risk. It was why I insisted on creating layers of protection around our assets. Trust structures, ownership agreements, contingency clauses. Richard hated those conversations. He called them unnecessary pessimism. I called them preparation. Around 9 o'clock, my laptop chimed with a new email. The sender was Martin Hughes. There was no greeting. No lengthy explanation. Attached was a document containing several pages of financial activity. I read through it slowly. Then I read it again. A series of transfers had occurred over the previous 48 hours. Large transfers. Aggressive transfers. The kind of transactions people made when they believed they no longer needed to be cautious. Richard had always been impatient. Success only amplified that flaw. The more confident he became, the less attention he paid to details. Years earlier, that tendency had created minor problems. Now it appeared to be creating something much larger. I leaned back and watched raindrops slide down the glass. Outside, the lawn looked gray beneath the clouds. The world seemed suspended between seasons. Not quite spring. No longer winter. In many ways, my life felt the same. The divorce had ended one chapter, but the next chapter had not fully begun. Most people assume the hardest part of a marriage ending is the paperwork. It is not. The hardest part is watching someone transform into a stranger while still carrying the face you spent decades loving. I had experienced that transformation gradually. Small changes at first. Missed conversations. New priorities. Unexplained absences. Then came the confidence. The certainty that consequences belong to other people. By noon, Martin called. His voice remained calm. Have you reviewed the transfers? He asked. I have, I said. And I looked again at the figures on the screen. He is moving faster than I expected. Martin paused. That may work in our favor. We spoke for another 10 minutes. Mostly facts. Dates. Timelines. Legal mechanisms. Neither of us raised our voices. Neither of us needed to. The significance was already clear. When the call ended, I walked into the kitchen and refilled my coffee cup. My hands were steady. My breathing was steady. Everything about me appeared ordinary. Yet somewhere beyond the walls of that quiet house, a chain reaction was already unfolding. Richard believed he was building a future. What he did not realize was that every transfer, every purchase, and every public celebration was leaving a trail. And trails have a way of leading people exactly where they never intended to go. That afternoon, I found myself standing in front of an old photograph hanging in the hallway. It had been taken 23 years earlier at a company anniversary dinner. Richard stood in the center of the frame, smiling confidently as he accepted an industry award. Most people who saw the picture focused on him. They always did. What they never noticed was the stack of folders tucked beneath my arm as I stood just outside the spotlight. Inside those folders were budgets, forecasts, acquisition plans, and risk assessments. The invisible work. The kind that never earned applause. I studied the photograph for a long moment before continuing down the hall. It was strange how memory worked. Some moments faded completely while others remained sharp enough to feel recent. The early years of our marriage came back to me often. Richard had been ambitious from the day I met him. He possessed a natural ability to command attention. Investors trusted him. Clients liked him. Employees admired him. He could walk into a room and leave with opportunities that seemed impossible only hours earlier. But talent alone was never the whole story. Behind every successful expansion stood months of planning. Behind every profitable deal stood careful analysis. That was where I came in. We balanced each other once. At least I believed we did. Looking back now, I can see the moment things began to change. Success arrived gradually, then all at once. New properties, larger accounts, national recognition. The higher we climbed, the less interested Richard became in caution. He viewed safeguards as obstacles. He viewed questions as negativity. Most concerning of all, he began treating loyalty as something permanent rather than something earned. That mindset eventually affected every part of his life, including our marriage. The signs were subtle at first. He stopped asking for my opinion on important decisions. Meetings appeared on his calendar without explanation. Financial reports arrived later than usual. Whenever I raised concerns, he brushed them aside with a smile and a reassuring phrase. "Trust me," he would say. For years I did. Not because I was naive. Because trust is what long marriages are built upon. Few people wake up one morning and decide to stop believing in someone they have loved for decades. The process happens slowly. One disappointment at a time. One unanswered question at a time. One uncomfortable silence at a time. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped. Sunlight filtered through the clouds and spread across the hardwood floors. I sat at my desk and opened another file Martin had sent earlier. This one contained records going back nearly 15 years. Names, dates, corporate structures, signatures. As I reviewed the documents, a realization settled over me. Richard had spent years assuming he understood every corner of our financial world. Yet there were agreements he barely remembered signing, protections he dismissed as unnecessary, mechanisms he considered boring details. I remembered those meetings clearly. I remembered sitting with attorneys and accountants long after everyone else wanted to leave. I remembered asking uncomfortable questions. What happens if ownership changes unexpectedly? What happens if assets are transferred too aggressively? What happens if someone attempts to bypass established controls? The answers became clauses. The clauses became protections. And the protections became part of the foundation beneath everything we built. At the time, Richard viewed those discussions as tedious formalities. Today, they were beginning to matter more than either of us could have imagined. My phone lit up again. Another social media update appeared. A photograph from the penthouse. Evening lights glittered beyond enormous windows. Guests laughed around a dining table. Crystal glasses reflected the city skyline. The comments beneath the photo were filled with congratulations. Success always attracts an audience. I looked at the image for only a few seconds before locking the screen. Then I returned to the documents in front of me. The celebration in New York felt loud. Temporary. The paperwork on my desk felt quiet. Permanent. And if there is one lesson I learned after decades in business, it is that quiet things often have the greatest power. The following morning, Martin arrived at my house just after 8. He carried a leather portfolio that looked older than some of the companies it represented. We sat in the library overlooking the back garden. The sky had cleared overnight, and sunlight spilled across the bookshelves. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Martin opened the portfolio, removed several documents, and placed them carefully on the table between us. I recognized some of the signatures immediately. Others took longer. The oldest agreement dated back nearly 14 years. I remembered the meeting vividly. A conference room in Boston. 3 attorneys. 2 accountants. Endless discussions about asset protection and governance. Richard had spent most of the afternoon checking his phone and complaining about how long everything was taking. At one point he even joked that nobody would ever need half the provisions we were reviewing. The attorneys laughed politely. I did not. I believed every document should be written as though one day it would matter. Martin tapped a page near the center of the stack. "This is where things become interesting," he said. I adjusted my glasses and read the language again. It was not dramatic. Legal language never is. The most powerful clauses often hide behind the most ordinary words. Transfer restrictions, control mechanisms, trigger events, protective review periods. To most people it would have looked painfully boring. To me it looked familiar. Suddenly memories returned. Late nights reviewing revisions. Conference calls during family vacations. Detailed discussions about protecting the company from reckless decisions. We had created safeguards not because we expected betrayal but because experience taught us that success sometimes changes people. Martin leaned back. Richard has already crossed several thresholds. I looked up. How many? More than enough. His answer hung in the air. Outside, a pair of robins landed near the garden path. The moment felt strangely peaceful considering the conversation taking place. I spent the next hour reviewing timelines, purchase dates, transaction records, corporate filings. Every new page revealed the same pattern. confidence, speed, assumption. Richard believed ownership gave him unlimited freedom. What he failed to understand was that ownership and control were not always the same thing. Years ago, we deliberately separated those concepts. At the time, it seemed like a technical distinction. Now it was becoming something much larger. Around noon, Martin packed away the documents. Before leaving, he paused near the doorway. "There is something else," he said. I waited. "The review process has already started." My expression must have changed because he offered the faintest smile. "You do not need to do anything right now. Just be patient." After he left, the house felt unusually quiet. I walked through the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood beside the window. Patience had never been Richard's strength. It had always been mine. Years earlier, that difference barely mattered. Today it mattered enormously. Later that evening, another photograph appeared online. A private dinner. Expensive flowers. City lights stretching toward the horizon. Vanessa sat beside Richard, smiling for the camera as though the future had already been secured. Hundreds of comments followed. Congratulations. Admiration. Envy. I read none of them. Instead, I thought about the documents resting in my desk drawer. Papers signed years before Vanessa ever entered the picture. Agreements created long before anyone imagined this outcome. Quiet decisions made by people who understood that fortunes are not protected during easy times. They are protected during moments exactly like this. I locked my phone, turned off the lamp beside my chair, and looked out into the darkness beyond the glass. Somewhere in Manhattan, a celebration was still unfolding. Somewhere beneath that celebration, mechanisms were already moving. Slowly, silently, and entirely beyond Richard's control. 3 days passed without any visible change. On the surface, everything appeared normal. The photographs continued. The celebrations continued. The illusion continued. Each morning I would see another glimpse of the life Richard believed he had secured. A private dinner overlooking the city. A weekend shopping trip. A gathering with friends eager to enjoy proximity to wealth. It reminded me of something I once heard from an old investor. He said that people become most vulnerable when success arrives too easily. At the time I thought he was exaggerating. Years later I understood exactly what he meant. Success creates confidence. Confidence creates assumptions. Assumptions create blind spots. And blind spots can become very expensive. On Thursday afternoon, I received another call from Martin. His tone remained calm, but there was something different beneath the surface. Something almost satisfied. "The review committee completed the preliminary assessment this morning," he said. I walked into my study and closed the door behind me. "That was faster than expected. Certain transactions tend to attract attention," he replied. I looked toward the window. A delivery truck moved slowly down the street. A neighbor was trimming hedges across the road. Ordinary life continued exactly as it always had. Meanwhile, events were unfolding hundreds of miles away that would soon affect people who believed they were untouchable. Martin explained several developments. None of them sounded dramatic. That was the strange thing about major financial events. The most significant moments often arrived disguised as routine administrative actions. Reviews, notifications, verifications, compliance checks. Simple words carrying enormous consequences. When the call ended, I sat quietly at my desk. I thought about the years Richard spent dismissing details. He always preferred grand gestures, big announcements, bold moves. He loved momentum. He loved appearing decisive. What he never appreciated was the power of patience, the power of preparation, the power of understanding systems before attempting to control them. Late that evening, I received an unexpected message from an old acquaintance in New York. We had not spoken in months. The message was brief. "I saw Richard tonight. He seemed unusually stressed." I read the sentence twice. Then I set the phone aside. For the first time since the divorce became final, I allowed myself a small smile. Not because I wanted him to suffer. I did not. 42 years is too long to erase completely. Despite everything, part of me still remembered the young man I married. The man who once worked beside me until midnight. The man who once valued my judgment. But memories cannot change reality. The reality was that he had made choices. And those choices were beginning to produce consequences. The following morning brought another sign. A photograph appeared online, but something felt different. The smile on Richard's face looked forced. Vanessa still appeared glamorous and confident, yet there was tension around her eyes that had not been there before. Most people would never notice. Years of business negotiations had trained me to pay attention to small details. Tiny shifts often reveal far more than dramatic statements. I studied the image for a moment before locking the screen. Then I opened my laptop and reviewed the latest updates Martin had forwarded earlier. Several new entries appeared in the records. Small developments individually, significant collectively. The process was accelerating. The machinery hidden beneath years of paperwork had finally begun to move. Slowly, methodically, exactly as it had been designed to do. And somewhere high above Manhattan, inside a penthouse filled with expensive furniture and spectacular views, two people were still celebrating a victory they no longer fully possessed. The call came on a Monday morning. I was halfway through breakfast when my phone lit up with Martin's name. I answered immediately. He did not waste time with greetings. "It happened," he said. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I set my coffee cup down carefully. "Officially?" I asked. "Officially." His voice remained calm, but I could hear the significance beneath the surface. The review process had reached its conclusion. The safeguards we established years ago had activated exactly as designed. Every condition had been satisfied. Every threshold had been crossed. Every warning had been ignored. I walked toward the kitchen window and looked out across the backyard. The morning sunlight reflected off the grass. A gardener was working at the neighboring property. Everything appeared completely ordinary. Yet somewhere in New York, a very different morning was unfolding. Martin explained the details one by one. Certain accounts had been restricted pending verification. Multiple transactions were now under review. Access to substantial assets had been temporarily suspended until compliance procedures were completed. None of the language sounded dramatic. In fact, it sounded almost boring. That was the irony. People imagine life-changing moments arrive with alarms and flashing lights. More often, they arrive through formal notices and carefully worded emails. After 40 years in business, I had learned that paperwork can alter lives far more effectively than emotion ever could. "Have they been informed?" I asked. "Notifications were delivered less than an hour ago." I thanked him and ended the call. Then I stood quietly in the kitchen. I did not celebrate. I did not feel triumphant. Mostly I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because Richard was facing consequences. Because the uncertainty was finally ending. For months, everything had felt suspended between the past and the future. Now events were moving forward on their own. Later that afternoon, another message arrived from my acquaintance in Manhattan. This time it contained no photograph. Only a short sentence. "Something is wrong. People are talking." I read it once and deleted it. Gossip never interested me. Facts did. By evening, Martin sent additional updates. Several scheduled transactions had failed to process. Certain financial institutions were requesting documentation. Internal reviews were expanding. The system was doing exactly what it had been built to do years earlier. Verify. Examine. Protect. I remembered the meetings where those protections were first discussed. Richard used to roll his eyes whenever attorneys talked about risk management. He preferred opportunity to caution, speed to patience, action to preparation. Those qualities helped build our success. They also created the conditions for his current predicament. Around 7 o'clock my phone rang again. This time the screen displayed a number I recognized instantly. Richard. The first call I had received from him in nearly 3 weeks. I stared at the screen while it rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Eventually the call ended. A minute later another attempt followed. Then a third. I did not answer any of them. Not because I wanted revenge. Because there was nothing left to discuss. The documents already existed. The signatures already existed. The decisions had already been made. No conversation could change that. As darkness settled outside, I sat alone in the library and listened to the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock near the fireplace. Somewhere beyond those walls, lawyers were making calls. Bankers were reviewing records. Advisors were asking difficult questions. Meanwhile, inside a penthouse that had seemed like the beginning of a perfect future only days earlier, reality was beginning to arrive. Slowly, methodically, and for the first time since the divorce became final, Richard was discovering something he had not felt in a very long time: uncertainty. The next 2 days revealed something I had witnessed many times during my years in business. Success attracts people quickly. Trouble makes them disappear even faster. Early Tuesday morning, Martin forwarded several updates. New reviews had been opened. Additional documentation had been requested. Certain approvals that Richard once received automatically were now being examined more carefully. None of this meant guilt. None of this meant wrongdoing. It simply meant that the assumptions supporting his recent spending spree were no longer being accepted without question. I spent most of that day in my garden. The weather was unusually pleasant for early spring. Fresh green leaves had started appearing on the trees, and small patches of color were beginning to emerge among the flower beds. For the first time in months, I felt no urgency to monitor every development. The process was moving on its own now. Years of preparation were finally doing what they were designed to do. Around noon, my acquaintance in Manhattan called unexpectedly. His voice sounded cautious. "You did not hear this from me," he said. "But several people were supposed to meet Richard for dinner tonight. Most of them canceled." I remained silent. Apparently there are concerns. Concerns. It was a polite word. Business circles often rely on polite words. They soften uncomfortable realities. People do not say confidence is disappearing. They say concerns are emerging. They do not say relationships are weakening. They say priorities are changing. Still, I understood exactly what he meant. Reputation is a fragile thing. It takes decades to build and only moments to question. That evening, I saw another social media post from Vanessa. Unlike the earlier photographs, this one felt different. The smile seemed forced. The caption was unusually short. More importantly, the comments had changed. The admiration remained, but uncertainty had begun to appear between the lines. Questions, speculation, curiosity. Nothing direct. Nothing openly hostile. Just enough to suggest that people sensed something shifting beneath the surface. I closed the application and set my phone aside. Long ago, I learned that public perception often reacts before official facts become available. People notice changes in behavior, changes in tone, changes in confidence. They may not understand the cause, but they recognize the symptoms. Wednesday morning brought another surprise. Richard called again. This time he left a voicemail. I listened to it while standing in my kitchen. His voice sounded different from the confident man who had posed in those penthouse photographs. There was tension beneath his words. Frustration. Confusion. He asked me to call him back. He said there had been misunderstandings. He said certain situations were becoming complicated. Then he repeated something I had not heard from him in years. "We need to talk." I deleted the message without responding. Not because I wanted to be cruel. Because there was nothing left to negotiate. The conversations that mattered had taken place years earlier in conference rooms and legal offices. The decisions that mattered had already been documented. The signatures that mattered had already been placed on paper. By late afternoon, Martin called again. His update was brief. "The pressure is increasing." I looked out the window at the quiet street beyond my front yard. I expected it would. "There is one more thing," he added. "Several people around Richard are beginning to distance themselves." That news did not surprise me. Wealth often creates the illusion of loyalty. When circumstances change, the difference between genuine relationships and convenient relationships becomes impossible to ignore. As evening settled over the neighborhood, I sat alone on the back patio and watched the sun disappear behind the trees. Somewhere far away, difficult conversations were taking place. Questions were being asked. Explanations were being demanded. And for the first time since this entire situation began, I suspected Vanessa was starting to realize that the future she had imagined might have been built on a foundation far less stable than it appeared. Friday arrived with a sense of inevitability. For days, the situation had been building momentum beneath the surface, and now the various pieces were finally converging. Shortly after 9 in the morning, Martin called and asked whether I would be available for a virtual meeting later that afternoon. His tone was professional as always, but there was a weight behind his words that immediately captured my attention. Who will be there? I asked. Representatives from the financial institutions, legal counsel, compliance officers, and several parties connected to the review process. I understood what that meant. After years of existing quietly in filing cabinets and digital archives, the documents we had created were about to become the center of attention. The rest of the morning passed slowly. I spent most of it organizing old files and reviewing notes from years earlier. As I read through meeting summaries and legal correspondence, I found myself remembering how seriously I had taken every detail. Back then, some people thought I was overly cautious. Others believed I worried too much about unlikely scenarios. Yet every safeguard exists because someone once experienced the consequences of not having one. By early afternoon, I was seated in my study with my laptop open. The meeting began promptly. One by one, faces appeared on the screen. Attorneys, financial executives, advisors, specialists whose careers revolved around understanding complicated structures most people never notice. The discussion remained calm and respectful. No one raised their voice. No one made accusations. Facts were presented. Timelines were reviewed. Documentation was examined. As the conversation progressed, a clear picture emerged. Years earlier, specific conditions had been written into the framework governing substantial portions of the assets. Those conditions were not hidden. They were not secret. They existed in signed agreements reviewed by multiple professionals. The problem was simple. Richard had stopped paying attention to them. Success had convinced him that old protections no longer mattered. During the meeting, one compliance officer summarized the situation in a single sentence that stayed with me. The triggering events were clearly defined, and the triggering events occurred. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just a statement of fact. Yet that statement carried enormous consequences. For nearly 2 hours, every relevant document was reviewed. Every signature was verified. Every procedural step was confirmed. By the time the meeting ended, there was little uncertainty left. The system had functioned exactly as intended. The safeguards had activated exactly as designed. And the authority governing the affected assets was now unmistakably clear. Afterward, Martin called privately. For the first time since this process began, I heard genuine satisfaction in his voice. "It is finished," he said. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window. The afternoon sun was beginning to lower behind the trees. "No appeals?" I asked. "People can always ask questions," he replied. "But the documents are extremely clear." After we ended the call, I sat quietly for several minutes. I did not feel victorious. I felt validated. There is a difference. Victory depends on defeating someone else. Validation comes from seeing the truth acknowledged. Later that evening, another update arrived from my acquaintance in Manhattan. This time the message was brief. "The atmosphere has changed completely." I believed him. Confidence can disappear surprisingly fast once certainty vanishes. I placed my phone on the table and walked onto the back patio. The air was cool and peaceful. Somewhere in New York, difficult realities were finally being accepted. Somewhere, people who had celebrated a future built on assumptions were discovering the importance of details they once ignored. And after years of being underestimated, dismissed, and written out of my own story, the foundation I had quietly built was finally speaking for itself. The following week felt remarkably quiet. After months of tension, legal reviews, unanswered questions, and endless speculation, silence settled over everything. Not the uncomfortable silence that follows uncertainty. A different kind. The kind that arrives when the truth no longer needs defending. On Tuesday morning, I received the final summary package from Martin. Several documents required my acknowledgement, but there were no surprises left inside. Every review had reached its conclusion. Every procedural question had been answered. Every authority had confirmed the same reality. The framework we built years ago had worked exactly as intended. I signed the necessary pages, placed them in the return envelope, and set them beside the front door for pickup. Then I made myself a cup of coffee and walked into the sunroom. The same chair, the same windows, the same peaceful view of the property I had looked at for years. Yet everything felt different. Not because my circumstances had changed dramatically, because I no longer carried the weight of proving anything. Around noon, my phone buzzed with another message from my acquaintance in Manhattan. This one was shorter than any of the others. Vanessa moved out. I stared at the screen for several seconds before placing the phone face down on the table. There was no satisfaction in the news, only clarity. Some people build relationships around trust. Others build them around appearances. When appearances change, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. Later that afternoon, Richard called again. This time I answered. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed. The sound instantly transported me back decades to a younger version of the man I once knew. I suppose you already know, he said. Most of it, I replied. Another pause followed. I underestimated you. The words surprised me more than anything else he could have said. Not because they were dramatic, because they were honest. For years, honesty had been missing from our conversations. No, I said quietly. You underestimated the work. There is a difference. He did not argue. He knew I was right. We spoke for less than 10 minutes. There were no accusations. No attempts to rewrite history. No grand emotional reconciliation. Just two people acknowledging the consequences of choices that had been made long ago. When the call ended, I felt something unexpected. Closure. Not forgiveness. Not victory. Closure. That evening, I took a walk through the neighborhood as the sun began setting behind the trees. Children were riding bicycles. Neighbors were walking their dogs. Sprinklers clicked softly across freshly cut lawns. Ordinary life continued exactly as it always had. It reminded me how easy it is to mistake money for security. Money can buy comfort, can buy convenience, can even buy attention. But it cannot replace judgment. It cannot replace character. And it certainly cannot replace the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you built something honestly. As darkness settled over Connecticut, I returned home and stood for a moment beside the living room window. Somewhere beyond the horizon, skyscrapers still lit the Manhattan skyline. Somewhere, people were still chasing bigger deals, bigger homes, and bigger headlines. I wished them well. My own priorities felt different now. The balance everyone obsessed over had never really been about dollars. The real balance was accountability. The real balance was truth. And in the end, after all the documents, all the meetings, all the celebrations, and all the consequences, that was the only balance that truly remained.